Hello and welcome to another of my video tutorials in my Introduction to Business series. And this one will be about organizing the business. Now, just like you as an individual with your thumbprints or your retinas, every organization has some type of unique structure. Some of our new business startups are going to begin with a very simple structure, but then over time, as they grow, they're going to evolve into a more elaborate structure. All organizational structures change, but some change more quickly than others. Over this video, I will talk about the building blocks of organizational structure, starting with like specialization and departmentalization. We're also going to describe a little bit about centralization and decentralization, delegation and authority as the key ingredients in establishing the decision-making hierarchy. Along the way, we'll look at the differences among functional, divisional, matrix, and international organizational structures, and examine some of the more popular forms of organizational design. Lastly, I'll close out with a little bit about the informal organization and intrapreneuring, not extrapreneuring or entrepreneuring. We'll talk about intrapreneuring. Well, I mentioned a term a couple times that I probably ought to define, and that's organizational structure. And this may be more muddy in some organizations than others, but organizational structure is the specification of the jobs to be done within an organization and the ways in which those jobs relate to one another. And when you think of the word organizational structure, one term that might come to mind right away would be that of the organizational chart, and many of you have probably seen these in your organization. And organizational charts are prepared to clarify the structure and to show the organization's employees where they fit into a firm's operations. The chain of command is going to represent the hierarchy of who reports to whom within that organization. Now, we don't just throw this together. There are lots of determinants that are going to influence the planning and creating of a very efficient organizational structure. Managers not only consider the organization's mission and strategy, but also the organization's size and its environment, both internal and external. Now, with these different determinants, chief among them are going to be the organization's mission and strategy. Size of the company and aspects of the organization's environment are going to affect organizational structure, obviously. Now, when we're creating this, this must be conducted with an equal awareness of both the firm's internal and external environment to be able to create that organizational structure so that it is effective and so that everyone understands it clearly. Most organizations change their structures on a continuing basis based on changes in their internal environments as well as external environments so that they're meeting the needs of the mission and what the overall strategy of the organization is. Now, the first step in developing the structure of any business involves three activities, and these are the building blocks of an organizational structure. And they are specialization, departmentalization, and establishing the decision-making hierarchy. Now, job specialization, this is a natural part of an organization's growth, and it's the process of identifying the specific jobs that need to be done and designating those people who will perform those specific jobs. Job specialization may even involve breaking jobs into smaller components prior to assigning them to the individuals of the organization. In a very small organization, the owner may perform every job. Now, as that firm grows, however, so does the need to specialize jobs so that others can perform them. Specialized jobs are learned more easily and can be performed more efficiently than those non-specialized jobs in the organization. It is possible to over-specialize, however, which will lead to boredom, carelessness, and a lack of job satisfaction. Now let's talk about departmentalization. This is the grouping of similar or related jobs into logical units. Departmentalization allows the firm to treat each department as a profit center or a separate company unit responsible for its own costs and its own profits. Now, there are several types of departmentalizations that exist. Now, those types of departmentalization that exist in the organizations occurs here. We have functional departmentalization, This is where organizations are divided according to a group's functions or its activities. Examples might include like a firm's production, human resources department, accounting department, finance departments. Those are examples of functional departmentalization. Now, product departmentalization, this is where organizations are divided according to the products or the services that the organization is either producing or offering. Process departmentalization is where organizations are divided according to production processes that are used to create the good or offer the service. Customer departmentalization, this is grouping where the grouping of jobs simplifies shopping by providing departments that offer products and meet the needs of identifiable customer groups, so specified to the customer. Geographic departmentalization is where organizations are divided according to the areas of the country or parts of the world that they serve. Another form that exists for departmentalization is where multiple forms come together. Larger companies tend to adopt different types of departmentalization for various levels and in various areas, so they'll combine some of these. Here's an example of that, as you can see in this diagram, where we have functional departmentalization, geographic, and product departmentalization all in this organizational structure. And now we'll look at that third major building block of organizational structure, and this is the establishment of a decision-making hierarchy. This is usually done by formalizing reporting relationships. When the focus is on the reporting relationships among individual managers and the people who report to them, it is going to be referred to as delegation. When it is on the overall organization, it becomes a question of decentralization versus centralization. And this is really about distributing authority when we talk about centralization and decentralization. Some managers are going to make the conscious decision to retain as much decision-making authority as possible at the higher levels of the organization structure, where others decide to push authority as far down the hierarchy as possible. In a centralized organization, authority is held by upper-level managers. Centralization is common in companies in relatively stable and both predictable environments, and is also typical of our small businesses. In a decentralized organization, authority is delegated to lower levels of management. Decentralization is going to be typical in firms that have complex and dynamic environmental conditions. It's also common in businesses that are going to specialize in customer services, allowing the company to be more responsive. Now, two other areas of distributing authority are going to be tall and flat organizations. Tall organizations are characterized by many layers of management and are more centralized, whereas a flat organization, as you see in this example here, flat organizations have fewer levels or layers of management and are more decentralized. You can see how there's a relatively wide span of control here. Now, if we take a look over here at the tall organization, you see how we have a very narrow span of control. And this is where I was saying that with a tall organization, you can recognize this because of the many, many layers of management that exists in their organizational structure. And when I talk about span of control, this is just the distribution of authority in an organization in which a number of people how many people are supervised by one manager. So the distribution of authority in that organization affects the number of people who work for any individual manager in that specific area. So when you hear the term span of control, just know that it means the number of people that are supervised by one manager. Now we'll talk about the delegation process. Delegation begins when responsibility is granted to a subordinate from their supervisor. Responsibility, as a term, is the duty that's going to be performed to an assigned task. Authority is the power to make the decisions necessary to complete that task. And if you have the authority, you have the responsibility, another big term that comes into effect here is accountability. When it comes to accountability, this is the obligation that those employees have to their managers who gave them that responsibility and that authority for the successful completion of the assigned task. So if I'm a manager, I can delegate tasks and delegate responsibility. I can delegate authority, and those individuals who I have granted that to, they need to then take accountability. They accept all that accountability. Now, while I'm on it, let's talk a little bit about authority. There are 3 forms of authority that we want to discuss here. And these forms of authority develop when an individual or individuals are delegated authority and responsibility in an organization. First, we'll talk about the line authority. This authority flows vertically up and down that chain of command. Staff authority, this is going to be based on special expertise and usually is going to involve advising line managers in areas such as law, accounting, human resources. These members of that staff help line departments in making decisions, but they do not have the authority to make the final decisions. Now, while these staff members generally provide services to management, line managers are directly involved in producing the firm's products. And the third form of authority, we'll talk about that now, and that's committee and team authority. This is that authority that is granted to committees and teams that play central roles in the organization's daily operations. Employee committees or those teams are typically empowered to plan and organize their own work and to perform that work with very minimal supervision or supervision. So those teams, they're given some power and they're expected to be able to do the tasks without having someone completely supervise them through the process. Let's take a look at the 4 basic forms of organizational structure here. And as you can see, I have those listed left to right here. With the functional structure, this is often used by small and medium-sized organizations. Functional organizations are going to divide the job responsibilities by the functional areas, such as marketing, human resources, finance. As firms grow, accountability becomes more difficult, so our organizations tend to move away from this structure. You can see we have 3 other options for that. We have the divisional structure. Corporate divisions usually operate under this divisional structure as relatively autonomous businesses under that larger corporate umbrella. Divisions are departments that resemble separate businesses in that they produce and market their own products or services. The structure relies on product departmentalization. We have the matrix structure. Sometimes you might hear this called a combination structure. This is one that is going to combine 2 separate structures. This is going to work better in either a simple structure alone. So rather than just using one of the structures, this is going to be much easier because it's going to combine them. Now, a so-called matrix structure is organized along 2 dimensions instead of just one. It's going to be combining some of these dimensions. For example, a functional and a divisional structure combined. That would be an example of a matrix structure. And using a matrix structure can add flexibility and adaptability to your organization. And this can either be permanent or temporary for a specific project. And lastly, the international structure. These have been developed in response to the need to manufacture, produce, and sell products and services in our ever-expanding global market. These structures frequently change as a company becomes more globalized. Here's an example of a functional structure where you can see that the functional areas are divided. And you can see that we have operations, marketing, finance, research and development. So that's an example of a functional structure. Here's a visual representation of an example of a divisional structure where I talked about how the different divisions operate under the larger structure as kind of autonomous businesses under that very large corporate umbrella. Like we have an area here for consumer products. We have one for healthcare products. That would be a divisional structure. Then here is an example of a matrix structure where if you look at this, you can see that this company is organized broadly into media and merchandising groups, each of which has its own specific product, and product groups listed here as they have combined into this matrix structure. And then here's an example of an international structure that's being used, this international organizational structure, where we have our divisions and we're creating our international division as its own entity, but it's part of the overall organizational structure. And you can see that even within the international division, we have 3 different areas that report to that international division. And that international division is going to change as it adds other areas internationally. It's also going to this was created in response to that need for a different global market. So as another global market gets interested into the organization, we'll add another area under that international division so that we can focus on the needs for the response for us to manufacture, produce, sell our products or services in that other international area that we'll add on later. Now, besides these 4 main organizational structures, there are some newer forms of organizational structures that have come, and the most popular of those are going to be team organization, virtual organization, and a learning organization. Now, a team organization relies mostly on project type teams. People flow around from one project to another as dictated by the skills and the demands of the projects. In a learning organization, the learning organization works to integrate continuous improvement within continuous employee learning and development. Now, the most consistent and logical strategy for achieving continuous improvement as a firm is to constantly upgrade our employee talents, skills, and knowledge to make us a better organization. And lastly, we have the virtualization organization. And with virtual organization, this organization is going to have little or no formal structure. It's going to exist only in response to its own needs. So employees, facilities, and subcontracted services will change based on whatever that project needs for that virtual organization. You can see that typically we only have a handful of permanent employees, as just a small staff to and as the needs of that organization changes, we as managers are going to bring in temporary workers, lease facilities, and maybe outsource some basic support services just to meet the demands of that next unique situation. So it's very fluid in how it works, and it's going to be dynamic based on what our needs are. Let's move on to informal organization. Now, frequently the informal organization, which is those everyday social interactions among our employees in an organization that transcend the formal jobs and job interrelationships, alter our company's formal structure. And we have 3 key groups here when it comes to those informal groups or informal organization. We have the informal groups. These groups are groups of people who decide to interact among themselves. Informal organization can be just as powerful as that formal organization that we've built. The organizational grapevine. This is the grapevine or the rumor mill. And this is an informal communication structure in which people communicate through ways that transcend that formal communication process. By identifying the key people in the grapevine, the manager can get very valuable information sometimes. And let's talk about intrapreneuring. This is a relatively new concept. This intrapreneuring is encouraged among businesses as a way of enhancing their creativity and their flexibility in those large bureaucratic structures. It's going to involve identifying and supporting inventors, the product champions, and the sponsors of new ideas and new products for the organization, or offering new services or creating new processes in that organization. Once again, relatively a new term and concept when it comes to the matter of informal organization. So hopefully that's a new term to you. Well, that's it for this tutorial or video lecture on organizing the business. We talked a lot about organizational structure. I hope it wasn't just some review for you, but I hope you learned some new things from this. So thanks for following along in my Introduction to Business series and for checking out this Organization of the Business video. Thank you, everyone.